Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
Last night my mother looked straight at me across the table and said, very calmly and very precisely, that my sister is everything I will never be. And for a second the room went quiet in that way it always does when someone decides to light a match in a place soaked with old gasoline. So I did the only thing that kept me from throwing the match back, which was to pick up the plates. Stack them like I have done since I was a teenager, tell everyone I had an early morning, and walk out while my heart hammered in my throat like I had swallowed a clock that refused to mind its manners. If you have ever been the family helper, the one who brings the extra chairs and the backup side dish, and the band-aids for the kid who will definitely scrape a knee, you know the drill, because you keep peace by carrying weight. And when the weight gets heavier you just bend lower and call it love, and my mother has always counted on that bend. So when she said that line about my sister being everything I will never be, she said it like I would do the usual thing, which is joke it off, make some self-deprecating comment, refill her glass, and make sure the evening ends with her smiling for photos she can post later with a caption about how blessed she is. I did not give her that out, because once I was in my car with the door closed and the polite smile peeled off my face like old tape that never sticks right again. I opened the family group chat where my mother posts baby pictures of my sister's dog and long stories about how the bank manager calls her by name, and I typed the sentence exactly as she said it, with the quotation marks and the pauses. And I hit send with my hands shaking, not because I wanted to fight, but because I was done with the secret version of our family where she can say anything she wants in a kitchen and then scrub it from memory the next morning like it was a stain that never set. I did not add insults or hashtags or commentary because I did not need to, and then, before anyone could reply with the usual jokes or the classic plea to keep things in the family, I wrote one more message that said I am stepping back from the unpaid roles I have been filling for years, that I will not be the planner, the lender, the late-night chauffeur, or the person who brings the folding table from my garage, because she decided to invite 2 extra people at the last minute, and I said if anyone needs something from me, they can ask me directly and treat me like an adult, and if they do not, that is fine too. On my way home, I stopped by her house, let myself in with the key I have carried on my ring since college, and left it on the entry table next to the bowl where she keeps her coupons. And I set down the gas card with my name on the account that I opened for her during that rough patch she pretends never happened, because I am not auditioning for Daughter of the Year anymore, and while I was there I took a photo of both items on the table, the key and the card lying there like 2 little exits. And I texted that photo to the chat without a caption, because sometimes the point lands better when you do not wrap it in an essay. Driving away, I felt the kind of fear that shows up when you say no to a pattern that has worn grooves in your life, and yet underneath the fear there was this steady feeling like a floor that finally stopped tilting. And I thought about how many times I had stepped in to clean up a mess, and then watched my mother turn to my sister with that proud glow like the sun only shines on one child. And I could feel something in me give up the need to prove I am worth a seat at a table where the price of a chair is my dignity. When I got home, I put my phone on silent because I knew the replies would come fast and dramatic, with those paragraphs that pretend to be concerned but read like a lecture. Yet I also knew this time I would not scramble to make it right, since I had already stepped out of the role, and the role was the problem, not the dinner, not the sentence, not even my sister, who has lived on a pedestal so long she probably needs a ladder to climb down without breaking something she cannot fix. I slept like someone who had just told the truth to a room that would rather starve than eat it, and in the morning when I finally turned my phone over, there it was, a message from my sister. Just one line that landed with the weight of a door slamming somewhere in the house we grew up in, asking what happened because our mother was crying in her room and would not come out, and I stared at the screen and thought, not for the first time, that sometimes the quiet thing you do after a long dinner says more than any speech you could give, and sometimes the first step out of a cage is just setting down the tray of food you have been carrying for years and letting someone else decide if they are hungry enough to serve themselves. When I saw my sister's message in the morning, I stared at the screen long enough to feel that old reflex tug at me, the one that says go fix it, go knock on the door, go make tea, go apologize for the tone you used even if the words were reasonable. Go be the designated smoother of edges because that is what you do, and that is why the family runs. And I felt it rise up like muscle memory that does not care who benefits or who bleeds, only that the machine keeps humming, and then I told myself out loud that I am not the machine anymore, and I am not the coolant, and I am not the replacement part that gets swapped in whenever something inconvenient starts to grind. I typed back that I left my key on the entry table and that I meant what I said about stepping back, and if Mom wanted to talk she could text me herself without the chorus and the script, which landed like a rock in a pond that has always been afraid of ripples. Because in our family, the rule has been very simple and very efficient, where Mom sets the mood, everyone pretends it is weather, and I come around afterward with umbrellas and towels and an apology for not predicting the forecast more accurately, but I did not say that part. I just put the phone down and opened my laptop and started pulling together the one thing my mother has never expected me to use, which is the paper trail. Maybe this sounds petty, but when a person tells you for years that you are the unreliable one while handing you the spare keys, the alarm code, the doctor's appointment list, and the bill that must be paid before Friday to avoid a fee, you learn to keep receipts. Not because you are planning a court case, but because you know one day someone will look you in the eye with a straight face and say you never show up, and you will need to decide whether you want to scream or whether you want to forward a file and go back to your coffee. So I chose the file and I pulled bank transfers where I covered the copay that one summer she could not manage and the Venmo notes where I sent my sister gas money during her internship that Mom bragged she funded. And the screenshot of the calendar reminder for the financial aid appeal I drafted with my sister on my lunch break while Mom sent celebratory texts about how we raise strong, independent women. I did not lace any of it with sarcasm or blame because the facts do not need costumes, and I put it all in a shared folder with a plain name that tasted like a boundary, something like household support log. And I shared it with a small circle of relatives who always get looped into our crises, and then told a softer version after the dust settles. The aunts who call me privately to check on me but never push back publicly because it is easier to praise my patience than to question my mother's behavior. And in the message I wrote that I am stepping away from logistics for my own health and clarity, and that this folder exists so no one has to argue about what did or did not happen. And I added a line that said I will not be answering group texts for a while, and if anyone needs me they can reach me directly and respectfully, which was the most boring sentence I have ever written and the most liberating. The replies started the way they always start, with concern shaped like scolding and empathy that arrives with a price tag. Questions about whether I had considered Mom's feelings and whether I might have misheard and whether I could have chosen a better moment to raise the issue, as if there is a polite calendar slot for being told your value is missing by design. And I let those messages sit, because I was not going to do the usual tango where I spend an hour crafting a measured response that gets skimmed for tone and ignored for content, and instead I listened to the voicemail my mother left, a long stream of wounded authority that accused me of sabotaging the family and embarrassing her and making my sister cry, which told me exactly what I needed to know, that the real injury was not the sentence she said at dinner, but the new reality where I refused to absorb it. My sister called after that voicemail, and when I picked up, she spoke in that fast, careful way she uses when she is trying to keep peace and keep me at the table and keep Mom from exploding. And she asked why I sent the group the quote and why I posted the folder like I was submitting evidence to a panel, and I told her I did it because I am done fighting in a hallway while a crowd in the next room claps for a performance they did not watch. And she went quiet and then said something that bumped me off balance, that she did not know about the copays and the gas money and the appeal letter, that she thought Mom handled those. And I said, I know you thought that because that is what you were told. And she said, can we meet without her? And I said yes, because despite everything I still believe you can love someone and stop participating in their myth at the same time. Before we hung up, I made one more small move that felt like a fuse no one else noticed, which was to change the settings on the family calendar so I am no longer the owner or the backup, and the recurring events that I created and maintained now prompt a message saying ask the primary organizer, which is my mother. And I felt something heavy and invisible shift when I pressed save, not because deleting my labor punishes anyone, but because leaving the labor visible finally makes the gap undeniable, and a few minutes later my phone lit up with another message from my mother that said, "I cannot believe you would do this to me," and then, layered right beneath it like a note slipped under a door. My sister texted that she wants to talk today, and she wants to do it away from the house, and she wants me to promise I will not tell Mom we are meeting. And I stared at the screen and realized the first crack had not opened in my mother's authority last night at the table. It had opened the moment I decided to stop being the quiet evidence locker, and now the evidence was walking into the light on its own legs. When my sister finally asked to meet without her mother, I said yes, because even though I was still angry in that deep, slow way that does not burn bright so much as sit there like a heavy object you keep moving around to different corners of your life, I also knew that if anything in this family was ever going to change, it would have to start with a conversation where no one was performing for anybody else, and when she showed up she did not bother with the usual small talk that we both use as patting. She just said she needed to understand what exactly I had sent to the group and whether I was trying to blow up her life or just refusing to prop up the version of it that Mom tells in public. And I told her as calmly as I could manage that I did not want to blow anything up. I wanted to stop being volunteered, and that those two things only looked the same because our mother had stapled them together for years and called the whole mess love. I told her that I kept records, not because I planned for a trial, but because you do not gaslight yourself when you are tired and broke and someone is telling you that you never show up. And I pulled up the folder and walked her through the notes that were not dramatic and were not edited for effect, just boring lines that said who paid what and when, and she stared at the screen for a long time and then said she had believed Mom handled those bills, which made sense because that is what Mom had told her, and that she had bragged to her friends that our family was a team, and I said our family can be a team when the scoreboard is honest, but the scoreboard has been rigged for a long time, and I am done playing for free. She asked me point blank whether I was accusing Mom of stealing from me, and the word hit me wrong because I had never let myself say it, not even in my head, and I told her I was not throwing around legal words. I was saying that my savings from that year after college, the money I set aside to move out of the apartment with the loud neighbors and the shared laundry, ended up covering her emergency that our mother did not want to call an emergency because it would have meant admitting that Perfection had a bill attached, and I had the transfer with the memo that Mom typed into my phone while telling me I was doing the right thing for the family, and maybe I was. But no one ever paid me back, and the story that got told afterward was that Mom had handled it like a champion while I learned responsibility by watching. My sister, whose name I should probably say out loud because keeping it vague has always helped Mom keep us interchangeable when it suited her, looked at me and said her name is Emily and she is done being managed like a project. And then she asked me to do something that felt small and surgical and exactly right, which was to call the bursar at her old college with her on speaker so she could hear the answer to a simple question about who filed the appeal letter that kept her aide from being pulled that spring, and I dialed and gave my name and asked the official to read the note on the account that describes the appeal letter. And when the woman on the phone said the letter was submitted by me with a copy of Emily's signature and a call log that shows I followed up twice, Emily did not cry or get loud. She just exhaled like she had been waiting years to hear something that simple and that clear. We made a second call, this time to the bank where the copay card lives, and again we asked a small question about which account covered the outstanding balance on the date in my spreadsheet, and again the answer was not complicated, it was my account. And in that moment I watched Emily run through the quick math of pride and guilt and disbelief that anyone who loves you would massage a story this hard for this long, and she asked me why I had not told her sooner, and I told her that I had, in pieces and with jokes, because direct truth has never survived long in our house without getting labeled dramatic or ungrateful, and she nodded and said she had not heard me because Mom always stepped in first with a cleaner version that asked less of her. She said she wanted to talk to Mom right then and there, and I told her she could, but I was not going to be in the room because I had finally learned that you cannot both testify and moderate in the same conversation without losing your mind. And I handed her copies of the 2 confirmations we had just received so she would not have to rely on my telling later, and as she left she turned back and asked me if I was sure this was not revenge dressed up as boundaries, and I told her that may be it. Was a little of both, because sometimes the only way to stop a pattern is to make it visible and then refuse to clean up the mess that visibility creates. And she nodded again and said she understood more than she expected to, and that she would text me after she spoke to Mom, which she did not have to promise, because I could already feel the ground moving under all three of us. And 20 minutes later my phone lit up with a new message from her that said she had just asked Mom about the savings and the appeal, and that our mother had gone very quiet and then very defensive, and then said something I have never heard her say in my life, that she might have to call a lawyer, which was such an absurd escalation that I actually laughed. And then Emily wrote one more line that made the laugh disappear, that Mom had locked the door and told her she would regret turning on her, which sounded less like a threat and more like a confession that the hierarchy had finally cracked and she had no idea how to hold it together without the usual glue. The next morning, I woke up to a series of texts that made my stomach knot in ways I had not felt in years, not because anything violent or catastrophic had happened, but because finally, the story that had been running through our family for decades was beginning to unravel in ways that I had always wanted but never dared to imagine, and Emily's first message was simple and unadorned, saying that Mom was crying in her room and asking what had happened, which I read over and over, because it was the first time someone in that house had admitted that the narrative I had lived under was not universal, that the perfect mask my mother had spent years polishing for everyone else was cracking in private. And I realized in that moment that years of small frustrations, unreturned favors, and erased boundaries were about to converge in one place where I did not have to hold the line or play nice anymore. I called Emily immediately, not because I thought she needed me to coach her through this, but because I wanted to hear her voice and measure the temperature of the shift that had taken place overnight, and when she picked up, her voice was calm but low, like someone who has just waded through a storm and realized the water is only starting to drain, and she told me that Mom had sat on her bed, hands trembling on the quilt, and said things that I had never expected to hear, including apologies. That sounded more like admissions and more like questions to herself than to anyone else, and I could hear her processing, the way people do when years of rigid certainty suddenly loosen, and I told Emily to stay with her, not to argue, not to push too hard, just to let her feel the consequences of her own stories without interference, and she agreed with a kind of determination that made my chest ache with pride, because Emily had finally learned to hold a line without being crushed by it. While she stayed on the phone with me, I thought about the dinners, the casual cruelty, the way Mom had drilled into me that I was incapable of matching Emily's achievements, the way every compliment she gave Emily was a silent reprimand for me, the way she had treated our savings and our accomplishments like a scoreboard with my name permanently at 0, and it hit me that the same woman who had spent decades molding everyone's perception of reality in her favor was now vulnerable in the most basic way, facing the evidence she had meticulously hidden and having no ally but her younger daughter, who she had underestimated at every turn. And I could feel the satisfaction simmering in my chest, but tempered it with patience, because the last thing I wanted was for this to turn into a spectacle. I wanted it to be complete and irreversible, a lesson taught without theatrics, a reckoning that could not be ignored. Hours passed with Emily reporting back in fragmented sentences between phone calls and texts, telling me that Mom had finally admitted out loud that she had told us different versions of the same events, that she had blamed me for things that were not my responsibility, that she had made me invisible while praising Emily in front of anyone who would listen, and she had done all of this without thinking about the impact, without realizing that the architecture of manipulation she built depended entirely on secrecy and control, and now that secrecy was gone, the structure was wobbling and Emily could hear it cracking, the walls bending in ways that had been impossible to witness before. And I realized that every small boundary I had set over the years, every time I refused to be her understudy, every time I said no to being her free labor, had been preparing for this moment. And it felt like watching years of careful engineering finally collapse under their own weight, only this time the collapse was clean, precise, and irreversible because we were ready to record and document and understand exactly what had happened and why. By late afternoon, Emily sent me a final text before I headed over, saying that Mom had gone silent, refusing to speak unless Emily promised not to involve me, and I told her not to negotiate with that silence, to let Mom stew in it. To feel the impact of the revelation that the lines she had drawn were being ignored, and when I arrived an hour later, Mom's face was pale, her voice fragile, and she tried to start with excuses and rationalizations, but I simply laid out the facts, calmly. Without emotion, without embellishment, each point confirmed by receipts, dates, and statements, and as I spoke, I could feel her shoulders slump, the mask slipping completely, revealing the human underneath who had depended for too long on appearances instead of honesty, and when I finished, there was no argument, no denial, just quiet, and I realized that the balance had shifted permanently, that the authority she had wielded with arrogance for decades was gone, and all that remained was the echo of her own actions reflected back at her. Mom sat there staring at the table, silent and uncharacteristically small, and I left the room slowly, allowing the space to settle, and as I stepped out, Emily caught my eye and smiled faintly. A quiet acknowledgement that the work we had done together was finished for now, that we had finally removed the scaffolding she had relied on, and that night, when we both went to our rooms, I knew that nothing would ever be the same because for the first time, the family story could no longer be told without including the truth we had reclaimed, and I realized that the most powerful act of revenge is often not loud or visible, but calculated, patient, and undeniable in its precision, leaving those who thought themselves untouchable staring at the results of their own choices and knowing there was no one else to blame. The next morning, after the quiet collapse of the mask I had watched unfold over the previous 24 hours, I woke with a sense of clarity I had not felt in years, not because I felt victorious in a petty sense, but because finally the narrative that had shaped my entire life was no longer dictated by someone else, and as I walked through the house, observing the subtle tension that hung in the air, I realized that every choice I had made, every small act of patience and restraint, every time I had refused to engage in the games designed to undermine me, had led to this moment where the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. And I understood that the most satisfying victories are the ones where the other person realizes the consequences of their actions without being forced to endure humiliation, where they are left to reconcile with their own decisions while you walk away unscathed but unmistakably changed. I called Emily first, not out of necessity, but to synchronize our understanding, to make sure we were aligned in how we would navigate what came next, and she answered with a quiet energy, a mixture of relief and anticipation, explaining that Mom had been wandering through the house in silence, occasionally mumbling apologies that sounded rehearsed even as they were genuine, and that she had refused to make eye contact, which was a victory in itself, because Mom had always relied on appearances and charm to manipulate, and now the only thing left was the tangible acknowledgement that she could no longer control the story, that we had rewritten the rules of engagement without lifting our voices or breaking the boundaries we had set. And it felt surreal to experience this shift without a dramatic confrontation, without yelling or threats, just the quiet power of truth. By midday, I decided it was time to make my final move, not a petty retaliation, but a strategic assertion of independence and ownership over my own life, and I approached Mom in the living room where she sat with a blank expression, carefully neutral, as if expecting me to engage in some ritualized argument, and I started speaking with calm authority, outlining the steps I had already taken in the past few days, reminding her of the emails, the receipts, the documented patterns, the timelines. That clearly demonstrated the favoritism she had consistently shown to Emily over me, and as I laid out each point, I observed her shrinking back, the careful poise she had cultivated over decades slipping like sand through fingers. And I realized that the power in this moment was not mine to wield alone, but a force created by years of observation, patience, and deliberate restraint, a force that now worked in our favor because it was irrefutable, clear, and comprehensive. Mom attempted to interrupt once or twice, offering explanations that were meant to soften the blow, but I held my ground, not with anger, but with unwavering clarity, each word measured and deliberate. ensuring there was no room for reinterpretation or misdirection, and as I spoke, I could see the tension in her hands, the slight tremor of her voice, and I knew that the long-standing belief that she could dictate our realities had ended, and that the only way forward was for her to recognize the truth we had reclaimed for ourselves, which was a revelation that would likely haunt her in quiet moments for years to come, a recognition that the authority she had assumed was conditional, fragile, and ultimately dependent on our compliance, which we had withdrawn entirely. After I finished, I left the room without looking back, leaving her to sit with the consequences of her choices, and Emily followed shortly after, smiling quietly at me, a shared understanding passing between us, that we had dismantled the carefully curated narrative together, that the household dynamics had shifted permanently, and that our positions were now defined by honesty, accountability, and the fact that we would no longer allow manipulation to dictate our lives, which was perhaps the most satisfying outcome of all, because it was complete, calculated, and irreversible, leaving Mom to confront the reality she had long avoided. Later that evening, Emily and I shared a quiet dinner in the kitchen, not as a statement to anyone else, but as a moment of personal victory and reflection, and we spoke about how the past days had unfolded, about the patience required to execute such a precise form of revenge, and about the unexpected power of calm and methodical action, and I realized that the most brilliant acts of retribution are not about revenge for its own sake, but about reclaiming your life, asserting boundaries, and proving to yourself that you are capable of taking control without losing your integrity, without stooping to cruelty, and with a clarity that leaves no doubt in anyone's mind about who is now in charge, who is capable, and who will never be sidelined again. And as I looked at Emily, I knew that we had not only rewritten the rules for our family, but also established a legacy of accountability and strength that would ripple through every interaction we had from that moment forward, a testament to the power of patience, observation, and the quiet, unassailable satisfaction of outsmarting a lifetime of manipulation without ever raising your voice.